welcome everybody to our research roundup. We do those roundups after we finish our projects. They're all public so that you can all join us and see see the findings, main findings from our project. So we have several people from our team, but it will be mostly Emma who will be talking. But before I'll turn it over to you, I just wanted really briefly to remind you about the Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research. So many of you know us, but we serve as the research arm for Montana's tourism and recreation industry. We were established 39 years ago in 1987, and we're housed at the University of Montana's Franke College of Forestry and Conservation. We are funded by a portion of the revenues from the state lodging facility use tax, and our goal is to provide objective research in tourism and recreation to support industry for strategic planning, marketing, policymaking, and management. We are overseen by the Tourism Advisory Council, and you can see here a diagram how our projects come about. Many of you know us for our many different projects that we do, but we have kind of ongoing resident and non-resident studies, but we also have every year a cycle of projects that usually last a year or a couple of years. And you can see here that we ask for your ideas for projects in the fall. We usually receive many of them each fall, then we review them and work with Tourism Advisory Council, trying to understand if it's really something we can do, have the capacity to do, if it's research or something else. And then if we get the approval, we conduct the research and provide those reports. So this is how this project came about. It was an idea submitted to us to better understand the impacts of museums in Montana and paleontological tourism. So, and here we are 2 years later. We started in 2024, and it took us about a year and a half to finish this project. And Emma and I just came back from the conference in Helena, where we also presented the findings of this research at the Montana Museum Association conference. It was a great gathering. So if anybody is here that saw us previously, thank you for being here. And I'm sure there are some people who also have not heard the findings. So with this, if you go to the next slide, Emma, please. I just wanted to mention that we'll start with a very brief background, talk about the purpose of the research, methods. We used mixed methods approach for this research. And then most of the time, for about 20 minutes, we are going to talk about the findings and then why it matters and what are some of the recommendations. So with this, I will turn it over to Emma to lead this presentation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And so a little bit of a background about how this project came to be. Museums in the United States are evolving into more interactive, community-centered spaces, making it even more important to understand their impacts and how people engage with them, especially in rural states like Montana. In this study, we used a mixed methods approach to examine both visitor perspectives as well as institution perspectives, focusing on the social, educational, and economic roles of museums across the state, as well as the Montana Dinosaur Trail. And overall, the research aims to provide a comprehensive understanding of how museums are experienced, valued, and sustained as cultural and tourism assets. This study has a dual focus. So first, it explores the overall impacts of museums in Montana. And then second, it delves specifically into, like I said, paleontology museums, aiming to gain a comprehensive understanding of the Montana Dinosaur Trail. The research purpose. So we aim to provide a comprehensive understanding the social and economic impacts of museums in Montana, as well as the challenges and opportunities that museums face. A little bit about the methodology. We had 511 valid responses from our surveys from museum visitors with 44 museums over 2 summers. Most of that was in the 2024 summer, and then we had 3 responses in 2025 summer. We were assessing the motivations for visiting the surrounding area, the museum experience, local spending behavior, visitation patterns, satisfaction levels, and demographic data. And then we conducted a pretty rigorous interview analysis of 18 virtual interviews with museum and paleontology experts, including executive directors, museum directors, board members, managers, and museum curators. And this was really to understand the visitor profiles of museum visitors, site values, perceived benefits and challenges, and then also the social roles that museums play in their engagement in local communities. So this is kind of a little visual of all of the museums that we surveyed at. We're thrilled to be able to share this with you. This plentiful and rich data that emerged from the research, and I'll do my best to share the findings from both the survey and interviews as succinctly as possible. We had a lot of really amazing results that emerged from this data. And this is the list of the order of the most responses received, and you can find all of this information in our report if you are interested in learning more about the individual museums. So for the survey data, we learned a lot about visitor origin. So respondents were split between Montana residents at 40% and non-residents at 60%. So most museum visitors were slightly more non-residents. So most non-residents came from Western states such as Washington, California, Arizona, and Missouri. Those were our kind of top states. Over half of Montana visitors lived in the same county as the museum. So this shows really strong local participation, with about 55% of those Montana residents being locals. Visitor motivations. So we found that the top reasons for visiting the museum included educational enrichment, local exploration, and supporting the museum, as well as fun and entertainment and family time were also key motivators. And then paleontology-related interests, if you kind of combine those percentages, that's about 22% of respondents. Trip behaviors, we found that 21% of non-resident visitors traveled primarily to visit the museum. And then this is included as a broader leisure trip. And so most visitors did not have the goal of visiting the museum as the purpose of their overall trip, which is maybe not as surprising as these museums are in pretty rural areas. But I think the point here is that many of these small rural towns serve as stop-throughs for a lot of visitors. Instead of quickly passing through to their destination, they may choose to stay longer in the local area as a result of museums serving as attractants. And that's pretty inherent when you look at the 3.9 nights per trip. That's kind of the average amount of nights that visitors spent in these local areas. A quote from some of our interview data is, "We're contributing to over $1 million annually to the local economy from non-resident use. Because we're touted as a destination, we help people stay longer in the area rather than just passing through." So this kind of speaks to that idea of not, these towns not really a stop through anymore. Really, people are staying a little bit longer because of these museums. Most people stayed in hotels or motels at about 47%, or unpaid accommodations like family, friends, or public land camping. Short-term rentals were at about 17%. So really hotels and motels being really the strong place that people will stay at. All right, so spending patterns. So survey respondents reported spending that exceeded $352,000 in total, not individually, across several categories. So lodging being the biggest attractant, so probably a lot of those hotels, motels at $125,000 in total. And then we have food, so restaurants and grocery stores, all of those places at $89,000 in total. Then we have retail and recreation, and then transportation. So our visitation trends, we found that 71% of respondents were first-time visitors, and then returning visitors averaged 5 visits per year and 19 visits over 5 years, which really reflects strong community ties and loyalty. And this is just the average. We had some people that were like, I visit 100 times a year. So there really is a strong difference there, and a lot of really strong community ties. 2/3 of all visits, 66%, were spontaneous or planned within a week. So we have people that are really spontaneous in their aims to go to the museum. So maybe they're just stopping through, they see the museum, and it's more of a spontaneous decision or along the road trip type of thing. So for information sources, cumulatively, about 39% is from online sources, making word of mouth, and online sources comparable in their draw, because we had 37% of people who found out about the museum through word of mouth. And so really it shows that both digital and in-person communication are both really strong sources of finding out about museums. So the experience and satisfaction, people were really satisfied with their trips to museums. About 92% rated their visit as excellent or outstanding. And then a lot of people, 72%, learned a lot or a great deal of information. And then the average satisfaction across a bunch of categories that included a variety of different items, 4.6 to 4.7 out of 5. So really high levels of satisfaction with things like the facilities, the education, the displays, and all of that can be found in our report. Slightly lower scores for accessibility and activity offerings at 4.3 to 4.4 out of 5, but still really strong there. So community value, we had an open-ended question, so we got to hear some longer answers from visitors. About 99% of respondents viewed their museums as important or very important to the community. People said things like hidden gems, this is an essential local asset. One respondent said, truly a jewel of the community. So really there is a lot of care and respect and value to these museums from the locals. So one person said, days of operation are decreasing from 1 day to 5. This will greatly impact our economy in the area. This is from locals and non-locals as well. So really showing strong support from local and tourist visitors as well. So now for the interview data, we had super rich, valuable information coming from these interviews. So now I'm gonna go through the main insights from these findings. And I put a lot of photographs in these slides, but please note the photographs do not correlate with the quotes. They were just fun photographs from the variety of museums that we spoke with and that were in our study. So our first finding was that museums are huge community anchors. They serve as vital gathering spaces and stewards of local stories. One museum we spoke with uses the community voices model, which relies on primary sources to tell stories, which, quote, reduces interpreter content and instead puts forward direct quotes and addresses stories that can be challenging to tell. One person said, we are a repository of family items. We serve as a protector of history for a lot of people. I really love this other quote, which explains, part of my goal is to build relationships with the tribal leadership and tribal members individually to make them feel like their history is just as important as the typical things represented in regional museums. Another museum expert said they're able to fill a void in their community by offering different programs when it's really cold out in the wintertime in Montana. And not everyone wants to go to a bar, and so they offer different activities in their museum. Museums are also huge economic drivers, which is also shown in our survey data, especially in these small rural towns. Museums are key catalysts, tourism catalysts that contribute to the local economy. Several rural museums reported annual visitor regional spending that exceeded $1 million. One respondent said, we're a huge economic driver in our local community, and our annual event has outpaced hunting in some years and economic impact in the community. Other respondents commented how their other overnight stays are huge and that they're anchor businesses for other businesses in the community right now, because they don't have a lot others that are kind of visitor focused. Museums are also educational and community partnerships. This is really kind of going back to that community value as well. So many museums collaborate with local organizations, mutually strengthening one another. One of the respondents said that the rising tides floats all ships, and they were explaining how their partnerships with other organizations not only strengthens their own organization, but really contributes to both the community and economic feel as a whole for the entire community. So in rural museums, museums often help bridge the gap in formal education and often serve as informal learning and recreation centers that contribute to local tourism and community vitality. I really love this one quote from one museum expert that says, "We are currently in conversation with our local high school and elementary school on how after-school programs can be officially accredited, something that supplements the school as well as help bridge the gap from when the school is out to when parents actually get off of work." So some museums actually serve as a source of childcare, which any parents know, or even non-parents like myself, like that's a huge, huge part of being in a community and having those resources available. There's also a lot of visiting schools. One respondent said they often have schools that visit from more than 50 miles away, and their farthest school is about 3 to 4 hours away. So that's a pretty long distance, and just as you know, Montana's pretty spread out. And so having these places for rural schools to go and bring their children is incredibly important and a vital community resource. So museums are also becoming more increasingly innovative and inclusion focused. They're diversifying their programming, so they include things like yoga classes, craft nights, lectures, and collaborations with Indigenous communities to expand audiences and foster inclusion. So they're really having a lot of different audiences in mind. I love this one quote by a respondent where they say, "Accessibility is much more than physical. Being an accessible institution is a much bigger idea and theme than whether or not we have an elevator or a ramp. We always have to be cognizant of the stories and how we tell them. And sometimes certain voices are elevated because of those are the voices that fund the opportunity. We work really hard to negate that as much as possible." So there's this really strong theme of making sure that every single perspective is visible in their communities, because that reflects the entire community. Museums are also becoming increasingly more focused on digital adaptation as well as rethinking their relationship with digital media as well. So during COVID-19, as a lot of people know, that it was kind of difficult to get into some museums. A lot of museums were shut down, or other ones, like the visitation wasn't great. And so it really prompted many museums to rethink the way they offer and publicize their programming, as well as rebalancing digital and in-person engagement. One quote kind of explains this, where I think that the classroom visits, both in person and virtually, are going to enable us to reach many more students than we can have inside of our facility. And then another person says, folks really want to get back in person and do stuff. So it's really finding that balance of using technology to both kind of further the word of your museum and making it more accessible to a larger audience, but then also understanding that museums serve as in-person resources as well, where a lot of people want to get out and do physical things with physical resources in their own communities and when they're traveling. So it's really understanding and rebalancing this kind of balance with technology as well as in-person interpretation. So a big part of our research was also looking at the dinosaur trail, and we found that through our research, paleontology is a major driver of visitation as well. The Montana Dinosaur Trail plays a major role in driving visitation, and particularly to visitors that are seeking out paleontology-related activities and opportunities, which we found was about 22%, so almost a quarter. One of the respondents says, "Our visitors are really interested in paleontology and geology, and they're looking for dinosaurs, so they've heard of the dinosaur trail." Other respondents explained how about 20% of their overall visitation was from the dinosaur trail, and then another one said about 30%. And so really hearing that a solid quarter, give or take, was just specifically people that are looking at museums in the context and the lens of traveling on the dinosaur trail. So there is a lot of potential here to utilize that knowledge for potentially gaining more traction in terms of offerings and kind of what museums can do to bring more people to their museums. So we also explored some challenges that museums face. A lot of those emerged through the interviews. So funding challenges were pretty big, possibly one of the most salient challenges that we heard from. So limited and restricted grant funding and fluctuating county budgets and rising operational costs, so things like energy, insurance, staffing, they really strain the sustainability of museums. Museum leaders called for flexible operations, eligible state funding, and reform to the Montana Museums Act of 2020 to better support these small institutions. One respondent explained, there's really not a lot of grants out there to pay the operating costs for museums. I think that's a complaint that we all share as museum staff. It's really hard to find funding to pay employees. And then another one explained how they had this conversation with the funder and they said, well, we don't want you to use that money to pay the electric bill, but if they can't turn the lights on, no one is going in the building. Another challenge was social challenges. In Montana, we have a lot of changing communities, especially in these kind of amenity-rich towns. Montana is rapidly growing, and there's a change in a lot of community dynamics. One respondent explained, we have experienced a shift demographically in our area in a very short amount of time. We really are trying to relearn and understand who our community is right now so we can best serve them. They explain that they think it might be a good thing because they can be pushed in new directions and new ways to best meet the needs of their community. But really, a lot of museums are kind of facing this understanding the identity. So one of our short-term rental projects actually talked a lot about like amenity migration and things like that. If you would like to check out that report as well about changing Montana dynamics in communities. Okay, staffing and volunteer shortages. So low wages, housing scarcity, and volunteer burnout limit the capacity of museums. A lot of museums really rely on their volunteers to help them staff their museums. One of the respondents explained, we could not open our front doors without our volunteers. And another said, our small staff is a major limitation that makes it hard for us to meet the programming needs of our community. Another explained, housing has become a major factor in our area, especially for employment. And again, this short-term rental report of 2024 discusses like population growth in Montana, amenity migration, and housing shortages, which is really felt that by the museum community and a lot of small nonprofits and organizations. Okay, so with all of that data, we have some recommendations to our community, our museum's community. And these were really thoughtfully created informed by our survey data as well as our interview data. So we really want to emphasize enhancing the operational funding flexibility. So revising the Montana Museums Act to include grants that cover operational and staffing costs and not solely relying on capital improvements. Supporting workforce and housing solutions. So developing state or regional initiatives to address museum labor shortages and housing barriers, especially in rural areas. Strengthening marketing and visibility. So increasing investment in digital promotion, unified branding, like statewide museum passes, and partnerships with tourism bureaus to capture spontaneous travels. Because like we saw, a lot of travelers are not really planning too far ahead. Expand educational integration, so foster sustained K through 12 and higher education partnerships, including vital curriculum, teacher fellowships, and field-based learning opportunities. We really found that partnering with local schools not only supports the museum, but supports the schools, and it really widens the capacity of community education. Encouraging community-centered programming, so continue diversifying events to meet local and social and cultural needs. So having things like craft nights, wellness programs, and Indigenous collaborations, really trying to meet the most diverse audience as possible, because as we know, our communities are changing, as well as we have existing people in our communities that maybe we can be better meeting the needs of. Leveraging the Montana Dinosaur Trail, so promoting paleontology tourism as a flagship statewide attraction, integrating data collection and shared marketing to measure economic impact. So we dove into the impact of the Montana Dinosaur Trail in this research, but continuing to expand and utilizing this information that this is a really strong attractant to potentially, reach even more people. And then lastly, investing in research and data infrastructure. So establishing ongoing visitor tracking and impact assessment to inform policy, demonstrate public value, and guide funding opportunities. Okay, so I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions. And so I think that I'll wrap up there. And I'd love to hear from the audience and see if anyone has any questions about our research.
Thank you so much, Emma. That was a wonderful summary of our findings. We have so much data, and our report is available on our website. All our reports are public, available 24/7. So please check this report out and other reports as well. This is the link to the report. And so, yes, and if now we have about 5 minutes. So if you have any questions, let us know. And we also, it is recorded, so it's going to be on YouTube on our channel. And Rachel just posted a link also to our report in chat as well, and you can scan this code as well.